Pay attention to this body cam footage. Watch the deputy on the left. See how he drops to his knees the second he lifts that storm drain cover. His whole body language changes. He reaches his arm down into that dark hole, and then, look at his face. That expression. That's not the face of someone who found a body. That's the face of someone who cannot believe what he's seeing. And now look inside the drain. There's a young woman down there, in a red shirt, smiling up at him like she's been waiting for a bus. Not panicking, not crying, smiling. In a few moments, she's going to say something to this deputy that will change this case forever. She's been underground for 8 months, and she went there on purpose. You know that feeling when you finally exhale? When something that's been weighing on you for months just lifts? For the residents of Ridgecrest County, that feeling came on a cold February morning when they learned that a girl they'd mourned, grieved, and eventually stopped talking about was alive. But the relief didn't last long, because when they found out why she'd disappeared, the whole county went quiet in a very different way. Ridgecrest County, Tennessee sits in that part of the state where everybody knows everybody, population 40,000, give or take. The kind of place where the pharmacist knows your name, your mother's name, and what prescriptions you've been picking up since you were a kid. Close-knit, comfortable, trusting. That trust, as it turned out, was exactly the problem. Nadia Voss was 18 years old in the spring of 2018. She'd just graduated from Ridgecrest High School. Barely, because she'd spent most of her senior year sick. Not dramatically sick, not hospital sick, just chronically unwell in the way that exhausted everyone around her and made people shake their heads sadly and say things like, "That poor girl," and "Such a shame, she was so bright." Headaches, fatigue, nausea, weight loss. Her grades had slipped, her friendships had faded. She looked pale and thin in her graduation photos. The kind of thin that doesn't look healthy, that makes people look twice. Her mother, Renata Voss, had died of a heart attack when Nadia was 14. After that, it was just Nadia and her stepfather, Donovan Reeves. To Ridgecrest County, Donovan was a pillar of the community. 12 years running the Ridgecrest Family Pharmacy on Main Street, coached youth baseball for 7 years, taught Sunday school, smiled at everyone. He was also quietly, methodically, poisoning his stepdaughter. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before anyone knew any of that, before any of it came to light, Nadia Voss was declared dead on June 11, 2018. Victim of an apartment fire. Tragic accident. The whole town came to the memorial service. Donovan Reeves stood at the front, looking devastated, accepting condolences. And 8 months later, Deputy Carlos Timmons lifted a storm drain cover behind the abandoned rail yards and found her staring back up at him. This is the story of how Nadia Voss survived, and how she made sure Donovan Reeves didn't get away with it. To understand what Nadia did, you have to understand what she'd already lived through. It started in March 2016. Nadia had just turned 16. Up until then, she'd been a normal teenager. Decent grades, a few close friends, played guitar badly, and loved it anyway. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn streak. Teachers liked her. She was the kind of kid who asked questions that made adults think. Then the headaches started. Mild at first. She ignored them. Then they got worse. Then came the fatigue, the nausea after meals. She started losing weight without trying. Her concentration went to pieces. Donovan, being the caring stepfather, immediately got involved. He had connections in the medical community, had been filling prescriptions in Ridgecrest County for over a decade. He arranged for Nadia to see Dr. Franklin Greer, a physician he described as one of the best diagnosticians in the state. Dr. Greer ran tests, lots of tests, and he came back with a diagnosis. A rare autoimmune condition affecting her nervous system. Chronic but manageable, he said. She'd need long-term medication, careful monitoring, a careful diet. Donovan handled all of it. He picked up her prescriptions, monitored her condition, made sure she took her pills every day. He was so attentive that people commented on it. "That man is a saint," Nadia heard her neighbor say once. "Raising that girl alone after her mother passed, and now this health trouble. He never complains." What nobody saw was Nadia's private journal, the one she kept hidden under a loose floorboard in her bedroom closet. She'd started it in September 2016, 6 months into her mystery illness. Not because she suspected anything at first, she just wrote to process how terrible she felt. The headaches that came in waves, the hair that was thinning, the strange metallic taste in her mouth that never fully went away. But then, on a Thursday afternoon in January 2017, something happened that changed everything. Nadia had come home early from school, another bad headache, sent home by the nurse. She wasn't supposed to be back until 4. Donovan didn't know she was there. She heard him on the phone in his home office, door half open, voice low. She didn't catch the whole conversation, just fragments. But the fragments were enough. "The levels need to stay below the detectable threshold." "No, I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this for 10 months. She presents exactly the way you described. Nobody's questioned anything. The insurance policy processes automatically when the death certificate is filed." Nadia stood in the hallway, not breathing. Insurance policy. She was 16 years old. She stood there long enough to hear one more thing before she crept silently to her room. "Just be patient. These things take time. You can't rush it." She sat on her bedroom floor for 3 hours, not moving, not crying, just thinking. Here's the thing about Nadia Voss that you need to understand. She was her mother's daughter. Renata Voss had grown up in a tough part of Nashville, had put herself through nursing school, had raised Nadia largely alone even during the years she was married to Donovan. Renata had taught her daughter one thing above everything else. "When someone shows you who they are," she used to say, "believe them the first time." Nadia believed it, and she started planning. She couldn't go to the police. She had no proof. A 16-year-old girl claiming her respected pharmacist stepfather was poisoning her? Who would believe that over a pillar of the community with 12 years of goodwill behind him? He'd deny it. He'd say she was confused, unwell, which, conveniently, she already was. And if he found out she'd gone to the authorities, she genuinely didn't know what he'd do. She couldn't go to relatives. Renata's family was scattered and distant. Donovan had no siblings. There was nobody to turn to. So she started doing 2 things simultaneously. First, she began secretly avoiding her medication. Not all of it. That would be too obvious. But she started flushing certain pills and reducing doses of others, keeping meticulous track of which ones she was actually taking and which ones she was discarding. She kept a record of everything in her hidden journal. Second, she started researching arsenic poisoning, because by March 2017 she'd figured it out. The metallic taste, the hair loss, the nerve damage symptoms. She'd spent weeks in the school library during free periods, reading medical literature, cross-referencing symptoms. She even managed to get a basic urine test done at a clinic in the next county, paid for it herself with birthday money, told them she was 18, and sat in that waiting room shaking. The results came back elevated, not dangerously elevated. Whoever was doing this was careful about dosing, but elevated enough. She was 17 years old and she had proof she was being poisoned, and she still couldn't tell anyone. So she kept planning. Over the next year, from March 2017 to March 2018, Nadia built her exit strategy. Carefully, quietly, while still appearing to be a sick, struggling teenager who was barely keeping it together. She opened a bank account at a bank in the next county, deposited small amounts of cash, money she made doing freelance graphic design online, money she saved from her school lunch allowance, money she earned doing odd jobs for neighbors while Donovan was at work. By the time she graduated high school in May 2018, she had $2,847 saved. She made contact with a woman named Teresa, who ran a resource center for homeless youth in a city 40 minutes away. Teresa didn't ask too many questions. She'd heard enough stories that Nadia's, a teenager escaping a dangerous home situation, wasn't unusual. Teresa told her about the county's old storm drain network, which ran under a significant portion of Ridgecrest County and connected to several access points near the rail yards. "There are people down there," Teresa said. "Not many, but they've been there for years. They've got it worked out. They're good people. If you need to disappear for a while, and I mean really disappear, they can help." Nadia filed that information away. She also, quietly and carefully, started gathering evidence against Donovan. Not enough to go to the police yet, but enough to document. She photographed prescription bottles. She wrote down dates, doses, symptoms. She noted every visit to Dr. Greer, every conversation that seemed off, every time Donovan handled her medication directly instead of letting her do it herself. What Nadia was doing during these months was extraordinary when you really think about it. She was living in the same house as the man who was trying to kill her, sitting across from him at dinner, saying goodnight, pretending to take the pills he handed her every morning, acting sicker than she actually was, because if she suddenly improved, he'd know something had changed. He'd change his approach. He might accelerate. So she performed her own illness. She came home from school looking exhausted. She declined invitations from the few friends she still had. She dragged herself around the house when Donovan was home, saving her energy for the hours he was at the pharmacy. She described this period later in her journal as the loneliest I have ever been in my life, not because I had no one around me, but because the person closest to me was the one I had to hide everything from. There was one close call in October 2017. Donovan had come home early from the pharmacy. A water pipe issue had forced them to close for the afternoon. Nadia was at the kitchen table with her journal open, too absorbed to hear him come in. She got it closed and slid under a pile of school books just in time. Donovan came in, looked at her, looked at the books. "Studying?" he asked. "Trying to," she said. He made them both tea and sat with her for 20 minutes talking about nothing in particular, and she smiled and nodded and kept her hands perfectly still so he wouldn't see them shaking. That night, she wrote in the journal, "Too close. I need to move faster." She moved faster, and then, on the night of June 9th, 2018, the timeline accelerated beyond her control. Nadia came home from work. She'd been waitressing part-time at a diner since graduation, and found Donovan on the phone again. She only caught a piece of the conversation this time. "I think she's getting suspicious. We may need to move the timeline up." That was enough. She had 48 hours, maybe less. She moved fast. She took her journal, her bank card, her ID, and the evidence she'd gathered. She left everything else, her guitar, her clothes, her phone, deliberately behind to make it look like she'd never planned to leave. On the night of June 11th, 2018, there was a fire at Nadia's apartment, a small studio she'd been renting for 6 weeks, the first place she'd lived independently since turning 18. The fire department ruled it accidental. Gas leak. Tragic. The apartment was fully burned out. Dental records were requested, but the fire had been too thorough for recovery. Nadia Voss was declared deceased. What nobody knew was that Nadia had set the fire herself, not to hurt anyone. The apartment was empty, and she'd made absolutely sure of that. She'd used a candle and a gas burner, and she'd set it carefully, and she'd watched it catch from across the street before she walked away. She walked 14 miles to the rail yards. She found the access point Teresa had described. She knocked twice on the storm drain cover, the signal Teresa had told her about. It opened, and Nadia Voss went underground. The group living in the storm drain network consisted of 4 people when Nadia arrived. Marcus, 52, a former construction worker who'd lost his house in 2015. Della, 38, who'd been living underground for 3 years after fleeing a domestic situation. Terrence, 26, who was working 2 jobs above ground and saving money while using the tunnels as a base. And Corinne, 61, who'd been there the longest and who everyone quietly deferred to. They knew what Nadia needed. They'd all needed it themselves at some point, a place to be invisible. They asked her one question: "Are you safe down here? Is there someone who might come looking who could find this place?" "Not if I'm careful," Nadia said, "and I'm going to be very careful." Corinne looked at her for a long moment. Then you're welcome here. The tunnels were not comfortable. They were not romantic. They were dark and damp and smelled of concrete and stagnant water, and the particular mustiness of enclosed spaces. Nadia slept on a foam mat that Della gave her. She used a camping lantern for light. She ate canned food and whatever Teresa, who became her lifeline to the outside world, brought down once a week. But she was alive, and Donovan didn't know it. Now here's something people don't think about when they hear this story. Going underground wasn't the hard part. The hard part was staying sane. Imagine it. You're 18 years old. You've just faked your own death. Your entire world, every friend, every familiar face, every street you've ever walked down, is above your head and completely off limits. You can't call anyone. You can't check social media. You can't know what's happening up there. You don't know if Donovan is worried or relieved or suspicious. You don't know if the police have opened an investigation or if they've already closed the case and moved on. You're in a concrete tunnel with 4 strangers in the dark. Nadia later described the first 2 weeks as a specific kind of hell. Not because of any danger, not because the others were unkind, they were anything but because of the silence inside her own head. The silence where her entire previous life used to be. She had nightmares about her mother, specifically about the moment she'd realized Renata was dead, the phone call, the numbness, the drive to the hospital that she barely remembered. In the dreams, her mother was always trying to say something, but Nadia couldn't hear through the tunnel walls. Della was the one who noticed. Quiet, perceptive Della, who'd been through her own version of disappearing and knew exactly what it looked like when someone was struggling with the aftermath. "You're going to go 2 ways," Della told her about 10 days in. "You're either going to fall apart down here, or you're going to find something to do with your hands and your head. Which one are you going to pick?" Nadia thought about her mother. She thought about the journal sitting in her waterproof bag. "I've got work to do," she said. "Then do it," Della said simply. That conversation turned everything around. The day after Nadia disappeared, Donovan Reeves reported her missing. He was distraught, apparently. Couldn't believe the apartment had burned. Couldn't believe she was gone. The fire investigator, a man named Gary Phelps, noted in his report that the origin of the fire was consistent with a gas leak. Accidental. Tragic. Nadia's death certificate was issued on June 24, 2018. And on June 25th, Donovan Reeves filed a claim on a $400,000 life insurance policy he had taken out on Nadia 3 months after she turned 16, in June 2016, right around the time the poisoning had apparently begun. The insurance company flagged the claim for review, standard procedure when a young person died in unusual circumstances. The review process was expected to take 60 to 90 days. Donovan was patient. He'd waited 2 years for this. He could wait another 90 days. Underground, Nadia was working. She had a system. During the day, when Terrence was at work above ground, she'd use his battery-powered tablet to access the internet from a spot near an access grate that caught a Wi-Fi signal from a nearby building. She created email accounts that couldn't be traced back to her. She reached out anonymously to the insurance company's fraud department, tipping them off that the death claim filed by Donovan Reeves should be scrutinized. She contacted a financial journalist at a Nashville newspaper using a burner account, providing enough specific details to get them interested in the story without revealing herself. She also kept building the evidence journal. Every day, she wrote. She recorded dates and events from memory, the conversation she'd overheard in March 2017, the phone call in June 2018. She documented the progression of her symptoms. She included photocopies of documents she'd managed to obtain before going underground, prescription records, a note from Dr. Greer that had struck her as oddly worded, a bank statement showing a transfer she couldn't explain. The journal grew. By October 2018, it was 26 pages. By December, 34 pages. By the time February came around, it was 47 pages. Handwritten, every entry dated, every claim sourced. She was building a case, from inside a storm drain, while officially dead. But here's what nobody knew at the time, and what only came out much later, during trial preparation. Nadia wasn't just writing. She was also teaching herself law. Terrence had a small collection of paperback books he'd accumulated over his time underground. Among them, by sheer coincidence, was a used copy of a criminal procedure textbook, the kind sold cheap at college bookstores. It was outdated by 8 years, but the fundamentals were the same. Nadia read it cover to cover, twice. Then she asked Teresa to bring her more. Over the 8 months she was underground, she read 4 legal textbooks, 2 guides to forensic evidence, and 1 book specifically about toxicology as it applied to criminal cases. She underlined things, made notes in the margins, cross-referenced what she was reading with what she'd documented in her journal. She wasn't just building a case. She was learning to build a case that would actually stick, one that a defense attorney couldn't dismantle, one that would leave no room for reasonable doubt. Marcus, who'd watched her reading one evening by lantern light with a legal pad full of notes beside her, shook his head slowly. "You're going to bury him, aren't you?" he said. Not a question. "Yes," Nadia said without looking up from the page. "Good," Marcus said simply, and went back to his dinner. Above ground, things were moving. The insurance company's fraud investigation had flagged the Reeves claim as suspicious. An investigator named Helen Marsh had been assigned to the case. Helen was thorough. She pulled the original insurance policy, noted the timing of when it was taken out, and began quietly looking into Donovan Reeves. What she found made her pick up the phone to the county sheriff's office. The policy had been issued in June 2016, standard life insurance, with Donovan as the sole beneficiary. But here's what was unusual. The policy had been issued through a broker that the insurance company had flagged in 2 previous fraud investigations. Small stuff. Nothing proven, but noted. Helen also found something else. Dr. Franklin Greer, the physician who had diagnosed and treated Nadia's mystery illness for 2 years, had his medical license suspended in another state 6 years earlier. Briefly, only 4 months, later reinstated. The suspension was related to improper prescribing practices. She passed all of this to the sheriff's office on October 14, 2018, 4 months after Nadia was declared dead, and 4 months before anyone knew she was still alive. Detective Priya Suresh was assigned the case. Priya had been with the Ridgecrest County Sheriff's Office for 8 years. She was methodical, patient, and deeply skeptical of respected community figures. She'd grown up in a small town. She knew exactly how much cover a good reputation could provide. She started pulling on threads. She subpoenaed Donovan's pharmacy records going back 3 years. She subpoenaed Dr. Greer's patient files. She contacted the original fire investigator, Gary Phelps, and asked him to take another look at his report. Gary Phelps, to his credit, was troubled when Priya laid out what she was finding. He went back to his notes, and he found something he'd noted but not pursued at the time. A small detail about the origin point of the fire that was consistent with accelerant use. He'd dismissed it at the time because the gas leak explanation had fit the available evidence. But looking again, with fresh eyes and new context, "I might have been wrong," he told Priya, "about the origin. Things were starting to crack, but it was Donovan who cracked first." By November 2018, Donovan Reeves was getting nervous. The insurance payout hadn't come through. Every time he called the company, he was told the review was ongoing. He'd hired an attorney, an aggressive one, to push for the payout. The attorney was pushing. The insurance company wasn't moving. And then, in December 2018, he received a visit from Detective Priya Suresh. She was friendly about it. "Just routine follow-up on the fire investigation," she said. She sat in his living room, in his comfortable house, and asked him questions he'd already answered months ago. He was smooth and composed, said all the right things. But Priya noticed something. When she mentioned Dr. Greer's name, something moved behind his eyes. Just briefly. Just for a second. She didn't push it. She thanked him for his time and she left. But she'd seen it, and it told her everything she needed to know about which thread to pull next. She contacted Dr. Greer directly. At first, he stonewalled, said everything had been above board, that Nadia had been genuinely ill, that his diagnosis was sound. But when Priya mentioned, casually, almost offhandedly, that the medical licensing board had been made aware of his file and would be conducting their own review, something changed. Dr. Greer called her back 3 days later. He wanted to talk. Off the record at first. Then, once his own attorney was involved and immunity was on the table, very much on the record. His statement, when it finally came, on December 28, 2018, was devastating. Donovan Reeves had approached him in early 2016. He'd framed it carefully, said he was worried about his stepdaughter, that she'd been exhibiting strange symptoms, that he thought she might have a rare autoimmune condition. He wanted Dr. Greer to see her, run tests, and provide a diagnosis and treatment plan. What he actually wanted, what he made clear over the following months, was for Dr. Greer to misdiagnose a poisoning as a chronic illness, to provide paperwork legitimizing the condition, to prescribe medications that would either mask the arsenic poisoning or supplement it. Dr. Greer had gone along with it. He was ashamed of that, he said. He'd been in debt. Donovan had known about it. It had been leverage. He told Priya something else. Donovan had mentioned in one of their later meetings that the girl was getting too sharp for her own good, that he was worried she was figuring something out. He'd accelerated the timeline. Dr. Greer had stopped cooperating with Donovan in April 2018, 2 months before the fire. He told him he wouldn't go any further. He thought Donovan had backed off. He hadn't. Priya had enough now for an arrest warrant. She went to the district attorney on January 8, 2019. The DA, a careful woman named Sylvia Park, reviewed everything and told Priya to hold off, just a little longer. They needed the physical evidence to be ironclad. Priya agreed, though it grated on her. She spent January building the toxicology case. She worked with a forensic specialist to construct a probable arsenic exposure timeline based on Nadia's medical records. The picture it painted was meticulous and methodical. Gradual escalation, careful dosing, designed to look like a deteriorating autoimmune condition. Meanwhile, something else was happening underground that nobody knew about. Nadia had begun to notice things, small things, but she'd trained herself to notice small things. Teresa visited every week without fail, every Tuesday between 7 and 8 in the evening, when the rail yard area was quiet. She'd pass supplies down through the access point, and Nadia would pass up any messages or documents she needed moved. It was a reliable, careful system. But in the third week of January 2019, Teresa came on a Wednesday. Not Tuesday, Wednesday. It was a small change. To anyone else, meaningless. But Nadia had been living by routines for 8 months. She knew every sound, every pattern, every rhythm of the underground world she'd built. Something that changed without explanation was a flag. "Why Wednesday?" she asked Teresa immediately. Teresa hesitated. "I had something come up." "What?" Another hesitation. "Someone came into the resource center asking questions. About me, about who I worked with. They said they were doing a welfare check on a former client." Nadia went very still. "What did they look like?" Teresa described them. A man, mid-40s, wearing a nice jacket. Not a police officer. She'd dealt with enough of those to know the difference. Something else. A private investigator. Donovan had hired a private investigator. This changed things. If Donovan had someone looking into Teresa, it was only a matter of time before they connected her to the underground network, before they started checking access points. Nadia had planned to come out in March. She moved her timeline up. She spent the next 10 days working at double pace, organizing the journal, making sure every entry was clearly dated and sourced, creating a summary document, a 12-page overview designed to give investigators a roadmap to the full 47 pages, making sure everything was waterproofed, double-bagged, and ready to move at a moment's notice. She also wrote letters. One to Detective Priya Suresh, whose name she'd learned through her anonymous contact with the insurance fraud investigator, who had mentioned the detective by name in a response email. One to DA Sylvia Park, one to the Nashville Journalist. Each letter was specific, calm, and constructed to be understood even if the journal wasn't immediately available. She gave the letters to Teresa to hold. "If something happens to me before I come out," she said, "these go to those 3 people, in order." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Teresa said. "Probably not," Nadia agreed, "but probably isn't the same as definitely." It was, in the end, none of Donovan's doing that brought Nadia out when she came out. It was a noise complaint. Underground, Nadia was completely unaware of the events that were about to unfold on February 3rd, 2019. That evening, she'd been organizing the journal by lantern light, making final notes, preparing for what she intended to be a controlled emergence the following week. Marcus was asleep. Della was reading. Terrence was at his second job. Corinne was somewhere deeper in the tunnel network, as she often was in the evenings. Above them, a group of teenagers had broken into the abandoned freight building to drink cheap beer and play music too loudly. A neighbor called it in. 2 deputies were dispatched, and Deputy Carlos Timmons, walking back to his car after finding nothing in the freight building, heard something below his feet. The rest, as they say, is history. Nadia was brought to the Ridgecrest County Sheriff's Office at 9:47 p.m. on February 3, 2019. She was examined by a medical team, confirmed to be in generally good health, slightly malnourished, vitamin deficient, but otherwise intact. She refused to speak about anything substantive until Detective Priya Suresh was in the room. It took 40 minutes to reach Priya, who had been at home, who drove to the station in a state of disbelief, who walked into the interview room at 10:31 p.m. and sat down across from a girl who was supposed to be dead. "I know who you are," Nadia said immediately. "I know you've been investigating Donovan." Priya stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching. I have contacts above ground. I heard things." She placed the waterproof bag on the table. "I also have 47 pages of documented evidence that I've been compiling for the past 8 months. You're going to want to read it." Priya opened the bag. She spread the journal across the table and started reading. She read for 22 minutes without saying a word. When she finally looked up, her expression was something between awe and professional composure. "How long have you known?" Priya asked. "That he was poisoning me? Since January 2017? I was 17? Why didn't you come to us?" Nadia looked at her steadily. "Would you have believed me?" Priya didn't answer. Because honestly, she wasn't sure. That night, with Nadia's journal in hand and Dr. Greer's statement already on file, Detective Priya Suresh called DA Sylvia Park. "We have everything," she said. "We're ready." Donovan Reeves was arrested at his home at 6:15 a.m. on February 4th, 2019. He came to the door in pajamas, coffee in hand. When he saw the deputies on his porch, he went completely still. "Donovan Reeves," Priya said, "you're under arrest." He didn't run. He didn't yell. He just went very, very pale. "She's dead," he said, almost to himself, barely audible. "She's really not," Priya replied. The forensic team moved into the Reeves home that same morning. What they found in his pharmacy storage, a locked cabinet in his home office that nobody outside the household had ever seen, was conclusive. Pharmaceutical-grade arsenic compounds, syringes, a dosing log written in Donovan's own hand with dates going back to March 2016 and amounts carefully recorded. He'd been keeping his own records. Whether out of compulsive precision or arrogance, he'd documented the poisoning himself. The dates in his log matched perfectly with the dates in Nadia's journal. It was, as the forensic specialist later said, the most comprehensive self-incrimination I have encountered in 23 years of this work. Now here's where things got complicated, and they got complicated fast. The Ridgecrest County community, which had mourned Nadia Voss, which had attended her memorial, which had brought casseroles to Donovan Reeves in his supposed grief, that community did not know how to feel, And the reaction was messier than anyone anticipated. There were people who were relieved and furious. Relieved Nadia was alive, furious at Donovan for what he'd done. That was the majority. But there was also a vocal minority who felt something else entirely. She'd deceived everyone. She'd made the whole town grieve a death that never happened. She'd set a fire, an actual arson. She'd manipulated the system. Was that okay? Was it okay to lie and manipulate and commit crimes, even if the reason was survival? The debate played out in the local paper, in church halls, at school board meetings that somehow ended up being about Nadia Voss, even though they'd started about something else entirely. It played out in comment sections and radio call-in shows. Nadia was aware of all of it. She read everything. She didn't respond publicly, not yet, but she was paying attention. One woman, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Hollis, who had taught Nadia in 8th grade, wrote a letter to the local paper that became one of the most widely shared pieces of writing to come out of the whole case. It read, in part, "We are angry that Nadia deceived us. We should ask ourselves why a child felt she had no other choice." That letter ran on February 17th, 2019. Nadia kept a copy of it. She still has it. While the community debated, the investigation was expanding in ways nobody had anticipated. Detective Priya Suresh, following up on a detail from Nadia's journal, began looking into Donovan's financial history beyond the insurance policy. What she found took the case in a direction that genuinely surprised even her. The $400,000 policy on Nadia wasn't the first insurance policy Donovan had taken out on someone close to him. In 2009, 5 years before Nadia's mother Renata died, Donovan had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Renata herself. When Renata died in 2014 of what was recorded as a heart attack, Donovan had collected on that policy $250,000. Priya sat with that information for a long time before she picked up the phone. She called the county medical examiner's office and requested that Renata Voss's case file be pulled and reviewed. The original cause of death had been cardiac arrest. Natural. She'd had a history of high blood pressure. It had seemed unremarkable. The medical examiner who reviewed the file, a careful, experienced woman named Dr. Sandra Park, came back to Priya 3 weeks later with something that turned the case from serious to staggering. The original autopsy had not screened for arsenic. There had been no reason to. Renata had been 41, with documented cardiovascular risk factors. Her death, while sad, had not been suspicious. But based on everything that had now emerged about Donovan's methods, Dr. Park recommended that Renata's remains be exhumed for further testing. The exhumation took place on March 4, 2019. Quietly, without public announcement. Nadia was informed beforehand. She asked to be told the results as soon as they were available, and she was. The results came back on March 22, 2019. Arsenic, in concentrations consistent with long-term, low-level exposure, the same pattern that had been used on Nadia. Renata Voss had not died of a heart attack. She had been poisoned. Donovan Reeves had killed his wife, had collected on her insurance policy, and had then turned to her daughter. When Priya went to tell Nadia, she found her sitting in the small apartment that the county had arranged for her, by the window, watching the street outside. Priya sat across from her and delivered the news carefully, watching her face. Nadia didn't cry. She was very still for a long time. Then she said, quietly, "I think I knew. Some part of me. I didn't let myself think it because it was too big. But I think I knew." There was nothing adequate to say to that. Priya didn't try to say anything. She just sat there, and Nadia looked out the window, and for a few minutes neither of them said a word. "She would have wanted me to finish this," Nadia said finally. "Yes," Priya said. "She would have." The additional charges related to Renata's death significantly altered the prosecution's strategy. DA Sylvia Park now had a pattern to present, not just one victim, but two. A man who had methodically used poison to eliminate the women in his life for financial gain, who had taken out insurance policies years in advance, who had arranged medical cover for his crimes through a corrupt physician. The defense team, already struggling, was now facing a case that had transformed from a poisoning to a double homicide. The body cam footage that Deputy Carlos Timmons had recorded the night he found Nadia, that footage became central to the prosecution's narrative in a way nobody had initially anticipated. It wasn't just significant because it documented Nadia's emergence. When prosecutors analyzed it, frame by frame alongside the journal, they were able to demonstrate a precise alignment. Specific events Nadia had documented in the journal corresponded exactly with timestamps from various pieces of secondary evidence: security camera footage from a pharmacy, bank records, access logs from medical record systems. The journal wasn't just notes, it was a timeline, and when laid against the official record, it matched point for point. The defense's expert, brought in to question the journal's reliability, spent 3 days on the stand trying to argue that an 18-year-old living in a storm drain couldn't have maintained such precision. That memory was unreliable. That the journal could have been fabricated or embellished after the fact. The prosecution's response was elegant. They brought in Terrence, who testified about the battery-powered tablet Nadia had used. They brought in Teresa, who testified about the specific documents Nadia had passed up through the access point on specific dates. They brought in Marcus, Della, and even Corinne, who had made her one and only public appearance, each of whom confirmed specific dates and details from their time underground with Nadia. Corinne, small and white-haired and completely unintimidated by the courtroom, leaned forward when the defense attorney suggested the journal might be fabricated and said simply, "Son, I watched her write it every single day, in the dark, with a lantern that gave her headaches. She wasn't fabricating anything. She was working." The defense attorney had no follow-up questions. The trial of Donovan Reeves began on September 8, 2019. The additional charges related to Renata's death were filed separately, but the cases were tried together. Finding an impartial jury took 3 weeks. People had opinions. Strong ones. The prosecution's case was structured around 4 pillars now: Donovan's own dosing log, doctor, Greer's testimony, Nadia's 47-page evidence journal, and the toxicology findings from Renata's exhumation. The forensic toxicology evidence established that the arsenic exposure timelines for both women matched Donovan's recorded dosing dates and financial activity. Donovan's defense team made their creative argument about fraud. Yes, Nadia was alive, but she had committed fraud. She had faked her own death. She had set a fire. Could the jury really trust the word and the journal of someone who had deceived the entire county for 8 months? The prosecution countered by calling Nadia to the stand. She was 19 years old by the time she testified. She'd spent the months since her emergence getting medical treatment, nutrition, counseling. She looked healthy. She looked composed. And she looked directly at the jury when she spoke. The prosecutor, David Okonkwo, asked her one question to start. "Nadia, why didn't you go to the police when you first suspected what your stepfather was doing to you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was 16 years old. He was a pharmacist with 12 years of goodwill and a Sunday school class. I was a sick teenager with no mother and no proof. Who was going to believe me?" The courtroom was silent. "So I decided," she continued, "to get proof, and then get more proof, and then make absolutely sure that when I finally did come forward, nobody could say I was confused or lying or just a sick kid with a grudge. I needed it to be undeniable." She paused. "I'm sorry I set that fire. I was scared and I was running out of time and I didn't know what else to do. But I didn't hurt anyone. And everything I did because he was killing me and I couldn't think of another way to survive." David Okonkwo then asked one final question. "Nadia, did you know at the time that your stepfather had also been poisoning your mother?" The courtroom went absolutely silent. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't know for certain, but I was afraid. That's why I couldn't wait any longer, because I'd already lost her. and I wasn't going to let him win twice. There was not a single dry eye in the jury box. David Okonkwo entered the 47-page journal into evidence and walked the jury through its contents: dates, observations, medical findings, documented conversations, copies of financial records, page after page of a teenager working alone in the dark to prove that someone was trying to murder her. The defense's counterargument, that she was a fraud who couldn't be trusted, never recovered. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 47 minutes. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Donovan Reeves showed no visible reaction. He sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Nadia, seated in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap, exhaled slowly and closed her eyes. Sentencing took place 4 weeks later, on October 14, 2019. DA Sylvia Park had pushed for the maximum. Judge Alan Whitmore agreed. Donovan Reeves was sentenced to 28 years in state prison on the charges relating to Nadia. The charges relating to Renata's death, filed as a separate but concurrent proceeding, added an additional 15 years to be served consecutively. 43 years total. He would be 86 years old at his first parole eligibility date. The aftermath of the Ridgecrest County case sent shockwaves through multiple systems. The Medical Licensing Board launched a comprehensive review of physicians operating in rural counties with limited oversight, resulting in new verification requirements for specialist referrals. The insurance industry revised their fraud investigation protocols, specifically around life insurance policies taken out on minor dependents, a direct result of the Reeves case. Several states introduced legislation requiring mandatory secondary review whenever a life insurance claim involved a minor beneficiary dying within 10 years of policy issuance. The county also commissioned an audit of its storm drain and tunnel infrastructure, officially for safety reasons, but everyone knew the real reason. The audit led to the creation of a county outreach program for unsheltered residents, funded partly by a community grant and partly by an extraordinary volume of individual donations from people who had followed Nadia's story and felt compelled to do something concrete. Marcus, Della, Terrence, and Corinne, the 4 people who had sheltered Nadia, were each offered transitional housing assistance through the new program. Marcus and Della accepted. Terrence had already found a permanent apartment by the time the program launched. Corinne, characteristically, declined. She did agree, however, to serve as an unofficial consultant to the outreach program. She still does. Teresa was profiled in a long-form piece in the Nashville paper, the same paper Nadia had contacted anonymously from underground. The piece won a regional journalism award. Teresa used the attention to raise funding for her resource center, which expanded to 2 additional locations in 2021. Deputy Carlos Timmons, when asked in every interview what he thought when he lifted that storm drain cover and found Nadia looking up at him, always gave the same answer. "I thought I was hallucinating," he said, "and then she talked, and I realized I wasn't. And then I thought, this woman doesn't need help. She's already handled it. She just needed a ride." Detective Priya Suresh received a commendation from the sheriff's office for her work on the case. She was offered a promotion to lieutenant. She declined, saying she preferred to stay in investigations. She still works in the Ridgecrest County Sheriff's Office. She and Nadia have had coffee together twice since the trial. Priya doesn't talk about those meetings publicly. Dr. Franklin Greer entered his plea agreement and served 3 years before being released on parole. His medical license was permanently and irrevocably revoked. He has given one interview since his release, in which he said he thinks about Nadia Voss and Renata Voss every day. "There's no version of what I did that was acceptable," he said. "I knew that at the time, and I did it anyway. That's what I have to live with." Fire investigator Gary Phelps voluntarily submitted himself to a professional review following his revised report on the apartment fire. The review found that his original conclusions had been reasonable given the evidence available at the time, and he was cleared of any wrongdoing. He retired in 2022. He attended Nadia's first public speaking engagement and sat in the 3rd row. Nadia Voss enrolled in college in September 2019, just days after Donovan's conviction, studying forensic science. She became an advocate for survivors of domestic poisoning, a crime that is significantly more common than most people realize and dramatically underdiagnosed because of how easily chronic poisoning mimics natural illness. She testified before the state legislature in 2021 in support of a bill requiring mandatory toxicology screening for minors presenting with unexplained chronic symptoms under the care of a non-biological guardian. The bill passed. It's called the Voss Protocol. In 2022, she established the Renata Voss Foundation, named for her mother. The foundation funds toxicology testing for families who suspect poisoning but cannot afford independent medical evaluation. In its first 2 years, the foundation helped identify confirmed poisoning cases in 4 separate families across 3 states. She also published her 47-page journal. Not in edited form, not cleaned up, not packaged into a memoir, exactly as it was, handwriting, crossed-out words, water stains and all. She wanted people to see exactly what it looked like when a 17-year-old sat alone in the dark and decided to fight back the only way she could. The foreword, which she wrote herself, ends with this: "I never stopped being scared. I was scared the whole time, but scared doesn't mean stopped. My mother taught me that, and she was right." Donovan Reeves was convicted of the following relating to Nadia Voss: attempted murder in the first degree, criminal administration of a poison with intent to cause death, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, obtaining medical services through deception, felony child endangerment. He received 28 years for these charges. For the murder of Renata Voss, he was additionally convicted of murder in the first degree, criminal administration of a poison resulting in death, insurance fraud. He received 15 additional years to be served consecutively. Total sentence, 43 years. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until age 86. Dr. Franklin Greer entered a plea agreement and was convicted of conspiracy to administer a controlled substance, medical fraud, filing false medical reports. He received a sentence of 7 years, with eligibility for parole after 4 years served. His medical license was permanently and irrevocably revoked. Renata Voss deserved justice. It came late, and it came in a way she never could have anticipated, delivered by the daughter she raised to never stop fighting. Nadia carried her mother's name into every courtroom, every legislative hearing, every conversation that has followed. And Nadia Voss, against every odd, against every dark and frightening and lonely month underground, made sure that both of them were finally heard. To every person who has ever been in the dark, literally or figuratively, and kept going anyway, this one's for you.